Tall Tales for Perspiring Teachers by Michael Baldwin. Chapter 2, Revolution in the Air. I graduated. For the lack of anything better to do, I began an MA at Queen Mary College. I lived nearby, above a greengrocer's shop, next to Stepney Green Tube Station in the East End of London. Money quickly ran out, so I signed on as a supply teacher with the Inner London Education Authority's Division 5, now known as Tower Hamlets Education Authority. They sent me to the Sir John Cass and Redcoat Foundation to teach English to 11-year-olds for 2 days a week. There I met Chris Searle. He also taught English, but very differently from me. He had a passion for language and saw how it could be used as an instrument for improving the lives of his students. By writing poetry and prose about their environment, they would not only understand it better, they might be able to change it. Chris would tour the streets of the East End with a photographer friend, recording the life, or lack of it, that they saw around them. They took pictures of desolate council flats, down-and-outs, meth drinkers keeping warm by a fire, a tramp waking up after a night on a doorstep, buildings deformed by neglect, people picking unsold vegetables off the huge piles of refuse that had accumulated throughout the dustbin men's strike. They brought the photographs into the classroom and used them to inspire the children, or kids as they began to be called about that time, to write poetry and prose about their own life and surroundings. It worked. The children saw in those pictures something they understood. They had lived with it all their lives. They had got used to it and had learnt to ignore it. Now Chris was asking them to come to terms with it, understand it, and get angry about it if need be. They produced powerful poems that were passionate and perceptive and showed that they understood only too well the kind of environment in which they lived and worked. The children quickly grew to love their teacher. They called him Chris and not Sir. Nearly everyone else hated him and was deeply suspicious of these new ideas. Sir John Cass was a traditional secondary modern, now called a comprehensive, in which the children had to be made to realise that the best to which they could hope to aspire was the job of a clerk in a bank. Knowing that all these children came from an area that was depressing and deprived, the authorities had an inbuilt fear that if the kids realised that they had drawn the short straw, they would rise up and take the law into their own hands, for they had little to lose and much to gain. They were therefore seen as a threat and were to be repressed. The principal agents of repression were the headmaster and the vicar. The head's office was set in the middle of the surrounding classrooms. Without getting out of his seat, he could hear even a minor disturbance in a classroom. If any child should raise their voice, he would simply guess who it might be and would bellow out the presumed offender's name over the tannoy system and order them down to his office, where they would frequently end up being beaten. This was his principal weapon and was designed to, and did, inspire terror in his subjects. His other weapon was the vicar, dog-collared and black-suited. This servant of the Lord would wander around the corridors with a cane, pulling the children out of the classrooms without explanation and beating them on the spot. The children and even some of the staff were cowed into silent submission. It was into this world that Chris had come, with his piercing blue eyes, his explorer's beard and his mission to improve the lot of the poor. He was like a modern-day Jesus Christ with attitude. Just as Jesus managed to annoy the authorities, so did Chris. He and the head were on a collision course from day one. Chris made a collection of the best of the children's poetry with the aim of publishing it. He began by sending it to the Daily Mirror. The poems were published on the centre page along with the photographs of East End deprivation. It seemed as if the whole country was suddenly talking about the East End, deprivation, kids, poetry, education. The head was furious. He claimed that his school and his pupils had been shown up in all their poverty and misery. Worse still, Chris had not consulted him, and thereby had undermined his authority. He also knew that the attention given to the pupils might somehow go to their heads, and they would be more difficult to subdue thereafter. He called Chris into his study and ordered him to apologize and promise never to publish anything written by the pupils of his school without his permission. Chris told the head that he had every intention of publishing the poems in a booklet, with or without his permission. The poems, he said, belonged to the children and not the school. He was merely enabling them to reach a wider audience. The poetry was published soon afterwards in a booklet entitled Stepney Words. It sold well. The children were excited. They had made a statement about their lives. People, important people, had noticed. The head sacked Chris. The children, all 900 of them, came out on strike. To begin with, they stood outside the school, unsure what to do. Then they marched, chanting, "Give us back our teacher!" from Stepney Green to Trafalgar Square. They played in the fountains and straggled home. The next day, their protest was front-page news in every paper. They gathered outside the school and refused to go back to class. The press arrived in droves. The PE teacher lost his cool and tried forcefully to drag some of the pupils back into school. Blows were exchanged. Photographs were taken. The weekend arrived, and by the following Monday the strike was over. The children had made their point. Some of them were getting bored. There was no one to organize the protest. It was time to go back. Chris could not go back. He decided to take the school to court for unlawful dismissal. With the help of the union, and after a case that was followed with considerable interest in the national press, he was eventually reinstated and continued his career as an inspirational and radical teacher. When these events unfolded, I was no longer teaching at the school. It was May 1971, and my own examinations were looming. However, on the day I heard that the children were coming out on strike at Sir John Cass and Redcoat School, I walked down the road to see what was going on. In the process, I was observed. A year later, I needed to re-enlist as a supply teacher, and went down to the offices of ILEA Division 5. I told the assistant who I was and what I hoped to do. She seemed positive about my offer to work, but then asked me to wait a while. She went into a back room and returned a few minutes later to say that there was no work available. Puzzled, I left the building. Some time later I met Chris. He explained to me that anyone who had in any way been associated with him during the whole affair had been blacklisted at the Division 5 offices of the ILEA.